So chapter 6 is one of the processes that's fundamental to life in cells. And so chapter 6 is on cellular respiration, where chapter 7 is on photosynthesis. And there is a relationship between those two. They are basically the reverse of each other. And they're the next sort of focus is these processes that go on in the cell. So cellular respiration, if we start with that, we're going to talk about that mighty mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell. And we are also kind of picking up where we left off with that molecule of ATP. And so basically, we need to get energy for cells to stay alive. And the key thing about energy is we're talking about potential energy. And so that's stored in chemical bonds, and specifically in ATP molecule, and more specifically between the second and third phosphate group. Last chapter, we talked about how ADP and ATP cycled in the body. And so now we're going to really focus on how the cells actually manufacture this currency of the cell, this ATP molecule. So we have a bit of an overview, and I'm going to divide this up into three sections because there are 3 stages of respiration. If we carry on from last day, and cellular respiration is an exergonic process, that means that it takes glucose and the potential energy in that and transports it into ATP. And so ATP and energy have been used kind of interchangeably, but we are getting a little more specific in talking about ATP as that molecule that is the energy currency. So cellular respiration is the key process. It basically can make a lot of molecules from glucose, but we're going to focus on that ATP. The 3 stages, you may have summarized before: glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, or you might know it as the citric acid cycle. And then the last one, the longest word, the one that I always say as many times as possible: oxidative phosphorylation. So that's a really long word. I promise to try and say it as many times as possible. I always joke that if you have a new houseplant or a kitten or something, name it oxidative phosphorylation. Anything you can do to make yourself kind of encounter that word as many times as possible, or those words as many times as possible, are going to be helpful. So oxidative phosphorylation has 2 parts to it. It has the electron transport chain and another funny word, chemiosmosis. And so this one is usually the last one to make sense of as we go through 1, 2, and 3 stages of respiration. But if we don't have this last one, we make basically no ATP in the process of cellular respiration. So it's really important to hang on to the details until we get there for that big payout. The last thing that this is going to do, this chapter, we're going to take a look at the difference between aerobic respiration, which is these 3 stages basically, versus anaerobic respiration. So anaerobic respiration, we're talking about lactic acid or alcohol fermentation. And so that's the last topic in the day's chapter. So there's a connection between photosynthesis and respiration. I said that they're basically the reverse of each other. So chapter 6, we're going to start with glucose. Use that mighty mitochondria down there, right? That is cellular respiration. That is chapter 6. And then if we go the other way, if we were to start with water and carbon dioxide and add the energy from the sun that's at the top there, that is that endergonic process of photosynthesis, and that's chapter 7. So this image sees it as kind of a cycle where we have consumers and producers, if you remember that from the first chapter or so. We also have endergonic and exergonic relationships here. And so basically, you know, this is how things work. It's why we do chapter 6 and 7 together in this course. And really what we're talking about is the energy that's going to be packaged in this process of cellular respiration is needed for life, right? All of the components of life that we talked about, or the criteria of life, is really why we have this process of cellular respiration. So it's a whole lot of biochemistry. It is fundamental. So be patient with yourself. It's a lot. All right, maybe just to also get a little perspective of what scale we're talking about here. We're talking still at the cellular level. So we started with some chemistry, we're moving up to the level of the cell. This course just gets bigger and bigger and really echoes the hierarchical organization that is seen in the study of biology. So we're down here in the process of cellular respiration. So on a cellular level, we have this process making ATP out of glucose and oxygen. We might think about our respiratory system. Your respiratory system is at a higher level of organization. So then we're talking about organs and organ systems. And so, on a cellular level, your respiratory system, the key job is this chemical reaction. In lungs, we have the gas exchange, so they're kind of nested together this way. So again, we're down here at that teeny tiny level that you can't see, unfortunately. So we've seen chemical reactions, we've seen respiration and photosynthesis written out as a circle, said they're the reverse of each other. This is a little bit more of a linear approach here. And so cellular respiration, or aerobic respiration, as I should probably more accurately say this, takes glucose, and that is one molecule of glucose. Remember, glucose is a monosaccharide, and oxygen, and it makes carbon dioxide, water, and energy. So we're going to focus on how many ATP molecules it makes, but it also makes heat. And you know that. That's why you get hot when you work or when you walk up the Rosemont Hill. The other thing in here that is probably a bit odd, these numbers out front here are basically there to say we can't create or destroy atoms in a chemical reaction. We have to account for things on both sides of the reaction. This, if you've taken a chemistry course, is about balancing a chemical reaction. So we don't really need to worry about them too much. You might be more comfortable down here with the words, or you might be more comfortable up here with those chemical formulas. There are options in how you study this because it's not a chemistry course, but hopefully, you are comfortable with O2 is oxygen, CO2 is carbon dioxide, and H2O is water. Those are handy shortcuts. They make the word smaller, basically. If I were to talk about photosynthesis, it's the reverse of this process. So I'd have to read it from right to left. Photosynthesis takes carbon dioxide and water and makes carbohydrates and oxygen. And the energy has to go in. And so when we read it in reverse, the energy comes in from the sun again. So if we focus, like the chapter is, on cellular respiration, it's exergonic. And it basically uses that chemical energy in food in making ATP. The key things that go in, I always talk about this as sort of a story with characters. We have glucose as a key character. We have oxygen as a key character. Those are the ones that need to go into the process. And then coming out of the process, we also have some key characters. We have carbon dioxide and water. I can tell you right now that as you learn this, you are going to be really tired when we get to the point of making water. It's probably the thing that people often forget in summarizing this process of cellular respiration, because it's on in oxidative phosphorylation, that last of the 3 stages. And like I say, you're really tired by the time you get there. But we're going to focus on, accounting for the glucose and oxygen going in, and then the things that come out, the carbon dioxide, the water, and the ATP molecules. It's about 40% of the energy in a molecule of glucose. It's not 100% efficient on a cellular process, and the balance would be released as heat. And so that kind of accounts for the energy, because we can't create or destroy energy in a chemical reaction. So the stages of cellular respiration, written out in color here, we have glycolysis as the first one. It basically takes glucose and breaks it down. We've seen hydrolysis before. So this breaks down glucose. That's the first stage. The second stage is you have an option. You could call it the citric acid cycle, and I'll talk about how citric acid is a molecule in that chemical process. Or it's often called the Krebs cycle. And so Krebs was the scientist who's credited for figuring out this biochemical process. And so it's a shorter word, and often I call that second stage the Krebs cycle, just because it's a shorter word. The third one, like I said, you're going to be tired when we get here, oxidative phosphorylation. If you think about what phosphorylation means, it really just means to add a phosphate group, being a functional group in biochemistry, and it works in the presence of oxygen. So they're hugely long words, but that's kind of the meaning behind them. Oxidative phosphorylation has two stages, the electron transport chain and chemiosmosis. Chemiosmosis is the big payout. It's the big payout that makes a whole lot of ATP. And so we have to get to that process of chemiosmosis at the very end of the third stage in order to actually do what we're trying to do when we talk about cellular respiration. So this video has the introduction, and I'm also going to summarize glycolysis, and then I'll break it up into the other two processes, just to kind of divide things a little bit. So each of the three stages I have summarized into the words on a slide. So glycolysis, here I'm going to read through and highlight the key words. So glycolysis starts by, or is breaking the glucose. It starts with glucose as a 6-carbon molecule and breaks it into two 3-carbon molecules. And so in this way, we've accounted for all of the carbon in glucose as a beginning point. So that's really what it does. It also produces some ATP and some NADH molecules. Now, NADH stands for nicotinamide dihydride, and you don't need to remember that. I think the key thing about these is identifying their role in the chemical process. They're energy intermediates. They're chemically roughly related to a B vitamin, and they really are something that happens within the process. They get made in glycolysis and the Krebs cycle, and they get used up in oxidative phosphorylation. So their key role is that they are also electron carriers. And so in them as electron carriers, they carry the electrons to the electron transport chain. And if we don't have that last stage, we don't get the big payout. So they really aren't in the chemical reaction overall, but they are in, the stages, and they are related to all this. This stage, glycolysis, happens in the cytoplasm, even though we are talking about the mighty mitochondria today, and there's no oxygen required for it. This is the end of glycolysis. Now, I put a little bit of an addendum here, and I'll summarize that on the next slide, where we draw out this process. And so there is a simplified process. We're not going to draw all of the stages of cellular respiration, but just to get our heads around the basic process of what's going on is we're going to start with glucose, which has 6 carbons. I'm doing linear glucose. And basically, it's going to get split into two 3-carbon molecules. So this is the process of glycolysis. These two 3-carbon molecules are called pyruvate, or sometimes called pyruvic acid, right? The other key thing that happens here is that we're going to produce some ATP. So what happens is that we know from last day that there's energy barriers. Even on an exergonic reaction, there's a buy-in, there's an energy barrier, there's an energy of activation. We have to put 2 ATP molecules into this, and it's going to yield us 4 ATP. So if you cross-reference with the words on the slide that came before, it says that there's 2 ATP produced in glycolysis. There's technically here 2 net ATP. Whoops, sorry. Right? That's the overall amount that you benefit from this process. We talked about net water movement when we talked about tonicity, and this is similar to that. It's like what's the balance overall, right? So it produces the two ATPs, and it also produces this key energy intermediate. So NADH, if you like that. If you don't like that, because those letters mean nothing to you, you could talk about them as energy intermediates. Or you could talk about them as electron carriers. And usually that's the one that students like because it gives context to their role in cellular respiration. They're going to hold those electrons that are going to go into the electron transport chain. So this happens in the cytoplasm. There is no oxygen, haven't talked about oxygen at all yet, and that's the end of glycolysis. On the word slide, the ones before, I had a squiggly line. There is something that happens between glycolysis and before the Krebs cycle. So I'm going to summarize that here. Basically what happens is each one of these pyruvate molecules is going to be converted to a 2-carbon molecule, and it has an attachment that's called a CoA. So this is not pyruvate anymore. This is acetyl CoA. And when you read the textbook, or certainly if you read the summary of the textbook, it summarizes glycolysis and says it ends with pyruvate. And then it starts the Krebs cycle and says, okay, the acetyl-CoA goes into the Krebs cycle. And I say, wait a minute. You can't tell a story if there's not continuity of character, right? We can't just end one chapter and then start with somebody that we haven't been introduced to. So this is introducing you to acetyl-CoA. Acetyl-CoA is what goes into the Krebs cycle. Now, another fundamental thing happens as we move across this squiggly line. You'll notice that I've lost a carbon atom. So the key thing that happens here is that carbon atom comes out as carbon dioxide. That was one of the key products produced in the process of cellular respiration. So in order to do that, that carbon is going to link onto an oxygen molecule. And so this part here, this kind of continuation of glycolysis, does need oxygen to prep the acetyl-CoA to go into the Krebs cycle, but the glycolysis itself did not need oxygen. So this is no oxygen, and it happens in the cytoplasm. This is not glycolysis over here, but this prepares for the Krebs cycle. All right, you'll also notice that in your handouts there was a summary page. You'll find a key to that summary page, and I would suggest taking your blank chart right now and filling that out with a summary in as few words as possible of the process of glycolysis.